Crowley published the Book of the Law in the year 1904, claiming it to be a transcript of the message that was channeled through him from this spirit Aiwass. And over a decade later, in 1918, Crowley managed to summon another another interdimensional being. He was engaging in a series of rituals called the Amalantra workings. Much like the Babylon working, the purpose of this endeavor was to create a portal to the spiritual world. And apparently he was successful because this strange creature was said to have manifested in front of him. This picture that you're looking at was not taken from the show X-Files. This is a portrait of the supposedly real-life entity that was drawn by Crowley himself. He maintained that this was an accurate portrait of the being as it stood before him. And this entity either called itself Lamb or it was named Lamb by Crowley. But either way, he considered it to be of interdimensional origin. According to Crowley, Lamb went on to communicate to him some cryptic messages regarding the secrets of life. And there's a lot to unpack in this supposed interaction, but what I found the most interesting was Crowley's claim that when asked to define the nature of our universe, Lamb simply responded by saying, "It's all in the egg." The following year, Crowley displayed this portrait of Lamb at his own public event in New York, which he named the Dead Souls Exhibition. And beneath the picture was the following inscription.
Lamb is the Tibetan word for way or path, and Lama is he who goeth, the specific title of the gods of Egypt, the treader of the path, in Buddhistic phraseology. Its numerical value is 71, the number of this book.
And there's one of those Buddhist connections that I told you to look out for. You see, Crowley was actually pretty fond of Buddhism and Hinduism. He actually devoted a lot of his lifetime to the practice and promotion of yoga, which, by the way, I'm sure that the popularity of yoga today is yet another facet of modern culture that Thelemites might attribute to the presence of the Aeon of Horus, but let's get back to the point. And to be honest, I have no idea where Crowley is getting his definition of Lama from. I could not verify that it means he who goeth. I tried to research the definition and etymology of the word, and to the best of my research, it just means venerable one or superior one. But regardless, I assume Crowley to be much more scholarly than I am, so we'll just go with his definition on this one. But anyways, I was able to confirm that the word lamb does indeed mean path in Tibetan. In Buddhist practice, it's most likely derivative of the term lamrim, and it represents what Buddhist practitioners recognize as the path to enlightenment. And you will soon understand why Lamb is an apt name for this entity in Crowley's portrait. But the first and most obvious question is whether or not it's a coincidence that this Lamb bears such a close resemblance to what we have come to know as the gray alien. Because you can't tell me that's not what comes to your mind when you look at this guy. And first off, considering that this sketch was made over 100 years ago, perhaps it would be more appropriate to ask why our modern concept of gray aliens bears such a close resemblance to Lamb. I specified the gray style alien because, as I assume you are aware, The public's perception of aliens and even the spaceships that they supposedly travel in has changed drastically throughout history. It's easy to see a difference between the metallic flying saucers of the 1950s and 60s and then the more sophisticated and high-tech style UFOs that are often reported today. And upon close examination, it's easy to see all types of similarities that exist between UFO sightings in any given year and the UFOs that are imagined by popular science fiction movies or shows of that same period. And it's an important point to understand because the same thing was true about the public's perception of the aliens who were supposedly piloting these UFOs. In the 1950s and 1960s, many people believed that extraterrestrials were human-like in appearance, but their skin color and clothing and other details varied widely. They were described similarly in many reported close encounters from that time as well. And before that, aliens were often envisioned to be more monstrous in appearance, with features like tentacles and scales or wings. And even further back, in the late 1800s, there was a common belief that aliens could be living on the moon or on Mars, and that they had developed advanced technology. And these beings were often depicted as physically superior and high-tech humans, but only with, futuristic clothing and advanced tools. And you can keep doing this all the way back throughout history, to a time before the concept of intergalactic civilizations was even a thought in the minds of most cultures. And yet people still had their sightings and abductions and close encounters even back then, many of which have been preserved through the lens of folklore and mythology. But instead of recording alien spaceships in the sky, people were keeping record of gods and thunderbirds and fairies and dragons flying around. And instead of being abducted by aliens, there were reports of abductions by trolls and monsters or spirits, and you get the idea, the history goes on. And of course, if you go back far enough, you're going to be left with the Bible, which doesn't describe aliens at all, but only God and his angels, and then these deceptive and cunning fallen angels who would love nothing more than to be accepted and embraced by humanity, even if it's in the disguise of something else. Remember that in Matthew 24, we are warned that there shall arise false Christs and false prophets and show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. And never forget that even Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light, according to 2 Corinthians 11. And on the topic of masquerading demons, I think it's interesting that so many of these alien encounters that we hear about include the combined elements of mental telepathy and spiritual messaging. Perhaps even the majority of experiences play out this way, with the entranced abductee receiving a familiar message about a coming climate apocalypse or a great war, and this urging of the necessity for humans to unite into some type of New Age universalist religion. And if I try to be unbiased, I just can't imagine a rational explanation for why some random and unrelated creature from a galaxy far, far away would care about the spiritual conditions of human beings on Earth. But through an occultic lens, these experiences are really not very different from the way Crowley described his interactions with Aiwass. Not only in the method of communication, but also the message that's being communicated, one of a coming new age of human enlightenment.
I seem to become one with the entire universe. Everything in the universe seemed to be contracted down to one small dot.
We are going to see more and more of these visitors from space, and that before too long, the evidence will be incontrovertible, that you will have on your TV screens and on your movie screens concrete evidence that the ships are here.
And this brings us back to Lamb and his gray alien doppelgangers. I think it's clear to see that as of today, these guys have become the poster boys for extraterrestrial life.
You were saying also these gray ones are the ones that we see most of the time, and you said that that there are a lot of different motives for them being here. The gray ones, what kind of a deal we got going with them? Is that the bunch that you suggest we've made a deal with for military technology?
I think we made a deal with them, and their ultimate, what they want to do is regenerate their own race.
You believe in part that the movies E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, were not entirely just the creative products of some Hollywood director, that maybe there's more to that. Why don't you explain?
They were carefully guided by representatives from MJ12, who is this organization that is in charge of the cover-up, in order to get us ready for the release of the information that there are indeed aliens. And in both those movies, they used small little creatures and in order to get us ready for this release of information.
To prepare us that the idea of benevolent aliens from outer space are going to help us out.
Unfortunately, they're not so benevolent. So they made probably one of the most disastrous mistakes when E.T. was put out. At that time was before we discovered what I call the double cross or the grand deception. and they were trying to get us used to the benevolent little creatures, but that isn't the case.
Return viewers may have noticed that I often use Wikipedia as a source for these documentaries. Not because I consider Wikipedia to be a reliable or credible source of information per se, but because I know that the majority of the world that I'm reaching out to does. And while writing this, I was surprised when I looked up the Wikipedia page for gray aliens and saw this picture of Lamb prominently displayed on the page and reported in the article, where this image is declared to be amongst the earliest depictions of a creature of this appearance, more commonly recognized as a modern gray alien. But Lamb's association with ETs doesn't end here, because within the last years of Aleister Crowley's life, he met and befriended a young man named Kenneth Grant. Grant was a British ceremonial magician and an admirer of Crowley's work, and like many others, he aspired to become the successor of the so-called Great Beast, and he served him directly as a secretary and personal assistant. Historians of this topic debate about whether or not Grant was Crowley's official successor, but that's really not of much importance to me. But anyways, if you'll remember, we have discussed the UFO wave of 1952 that occurred a few months after the death of Jack Parsons. Well, by that note, it's interesting that Aleister Crowley died on December of 1947, the year that initiated this modern UFO craze with the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting, as well as the crash in Roswell, New Mexico, which occurred that same year. And it seems coincidental, but in the mind of disciple Kenneth Grant, there was a significant connection between the timing of Crowley's death and the occurrence of these famous UFO events. And in the time that Grant spent working under Crowley, the two would grow really close. And knowing that Grant had developed a deep interest in Lamb, Crowley had decided to ceremoniously present him with the original portrait of Lamb as both a gift and also a supposed magical resource. And then sometime after Crowley's death, Grant would create the Typhonian Order, an offshoot of the OTO. And while his new cult would maintain the general precepts of Thelema, it seems to me that the Typhonian Order was more primarily focused on ritual or psychic communications with non-human entities, by which Lamb was and continues to be a prominent source. And over time, Grant would become increasingly outspoken regarding his belief in UFOs and the topic of ufology, and he would write about it somewhat frequently throughout his 9-volume Typhonian Trilogy series of books. And I mean, keep in mind that I haven't read through these books personally, but it's pretty easy to confirm amid the many quotes and excerpts that flourish all over the internet. And he included this now famous portrait of Lamb in numerous publications. One of his more outstanding beliefs was the idea that Lamb was in fact the same entity as Aiwass, that disembodied voice that Aleister Crowley supposedly channeled in his Book of the Law, that I spoke on earlier. And in his book, Outside the Circles of Time, Grant describes Lamb to be a, quote, extraterrestrial and praetor-human intelligence. And he even claims that Lamb is now known to be a link between the star systems of Sirius and Andromeda. He also goes on to explore the mystical significance of the number 71, which Crowley originally attributed to Lamb in 1918, if you'll remember. And it's a number that continues to pop up in relation to ufology, by the way. And furthermore, it was a number that was of special significance to Grant because it was similar to his own numerical magical identity of 718 or 718. And I know that this opens a whole new can of worms regarding numerology and gematria, but we're just going to save that for another time. Just understand that in the same way that Crowley regarded himself as 666, Grant's number was 718. So just keep that in mind because it will come up again shortly. Now, according to Kenneth Grant's philosophy, this otherworldly and alien-like appearance of Lamb was itself the very purpose of Lamb's presence. He viewed Lamb as a gateway and conduit to another world, or to put it in more practical terms, as a path of exploration into another realm. Grant once wrote,
"If man is able to integrate these new experiences into his psyche, he must begin now to think in terms at least of extraterrestrial encounter. If he does this, the rest may follow. The faculty of intuitive insight may be awakened and aligned with such alien concepts."
And to say that Lamb has become a central figure in the Typhonian Order would be an understatement. As time went on, Grant would develop a new faction within the order by the unambiguous name the Cult of Lamb. It was a group that would devote themselves to pursuing this path of Lamb. And if you think I'm exaggerating, then let me draw your attention to this excerpt that I took from an internal memo from within the organization of the so-called Typhonian Order about the Cult of Lamb that was written by Grant himself.
The cult has been founded because very strong intimations have been received by Aosic Aiwass 718 to the effect that the portrait of Lamb the original drawing of which was given by 666 to 718 under curious circumstances, is the present focus of an extraterrestrial and perhaps trans-plutonic energy, which the OTO is required to communicate at this critical period, for we have now entered the 80s mentioned in the Book of the Law. It is our aim to obtain some insight not only into the nature of Lamb, but also into the possibilities of using the egg as an astral space capsule for traveling to Lamb's domain, or for exploring extraterrestrial spaces.
And at the end, it's signed off by Kenneth Grant using his silly magical name. So you can see that this association between Lamb and extraterrestrials goes far deeper than his similarity in appearance to our modern gray aliens. And although this information may not be a smoking gun of evidence, I hope you'd agree that we've covered some pretty interesting and substantial connections so far. But we're really just getting started.